On the rainy morning, Officer Ethan Cox brought Juno home. The old German Shepherd did not step inside like a dog who had been rescued. At 10 years old, with a silvered muzzle and scars left by years of being used for breeding, she stopped at the doorway and lowered herself onto the cold porch, as if she already knew this home was only temporary. Ethan, a 46-year-old community police officer still grieving the wife he had lost 2 years earlier, understood that kind of silence. He had spent so long living alone that even his own house no longer felt like a home. One man had forgotten how to let anyone stay. One old dog had never learned that she was allowed to, and when night fell, Ethan opened the door and called her name. But Juno did not move, because somewhere inside her wounded heart she was still waiting for the moment he would send her away. What Ethan did next would not only teach Juno the meaning of home, it would quietly bring an entire town back together. Stay with Juno until the end, and if her journey touches your heart, leave a like and share a few words in the comments. We would love to know where you are listening from. On a cold, rainy morning in Astoria, Oregon, the harbor was hidden behind gray mist, and the old street smelled of wet wood, salt, and early winter. Officer Ethan Cox had not planned to stop at Harbor Light Animal Shelter that day for anything personal. He was 46 years old, a community police officer with the Astoria Police Department, the kind of man people called when a neighbor went missing, when a storm took down a power line, or when a frightened child needed someone calm to kneel beside them and say everything would be all right. Ethan had built a career out of being steady for other people. It was what he knew how to do. What he did not know anymore was how to come home to a house that did not answer him. That morning, he parked his patrol vehicle beside the low-brick shelter building just after 8. Rain tapped steadily against the windshield, turning the parking lot into a dull mirror. Across the road, the empty shell of an old cannery stood with broken windows and rusted doors. 2 nights earlier, Animal Control had found several abandoned dogs near that building, shivering beneath a loading dock. Ethan had been assigned to complete the report, confirm the location, and collect statements from the shelter staff. It should have been simple work: a few forms, a few signatures, maybe a cup of weak shelter coffee if someone offered. Then back to the station before noon. He stepped out, pulled his jacket tighter against the damp air, and walked toward the entrance. Inside Harbor Light, the sound came first. Not chaos exactly, but life packed into narrow rooms. Dogs barked from behind kennel doors. Metal bowls clattered. Somewhere in the back, a washing machine thumped through a tired cycle. The air carried the clean bite of disinfectant mixed with wet fur and canned food. Rachel Campbell met him near the front desk. She was 45, the shelter manager, and she had the worn patience of someone who had learned to love too many animals she could not keep. A clipboard rested against her hip, and a pair of reading glasses hung from a cord around her neck. "Officer Cox," she said, giving him a tired but genuine smile. "Thanks for coming in." "Morning, Rachel," Ethan said. "You holding up?" She glanced toward the hallway of kennels. "Depends which dog you ask." There was warmth in the answer, but not much humor. Ethan understood. Places like Harbor Light survived on donations, long hours, and people who refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Rachel led him into a small office off the main corridor. She walked him through what Animal Control had reported. 4 dogs had been found near the cannery. 2 were already in foster care. 1 was being treated for an infection. The 4th, Rachel said, had not caused trouble, not once, but she worried about that dog most of all. Ethan looked up from his notes. "Why?" Rachel paused. "Because she acts like she's trying not to take up space." That sentence stayed with him longer than it should have. They finished the paperwork slowly. Rachel answered every question carefully: dates, times, condition of the dogs, the name of the officer who first responded. Ethan wrote in clean block letters, his pen moving across the form with practiced calm. Outside the small office window, rain slid down the glass in crooked lines. When the report was done, Rachel stood. "I'll show you where they came in. The kennel log is back here." Ethan followed her down the hall. As they passed the kennels, several dogs rushed forward. Some barked, some jumped. One pressed a rubber toy against the fence as if it had been waiting all morning for the right person to admire it. Ethan gave a faint smile, the kind that came and went before it could become anything larger. Then he saw her. The kennel was near the end of the row, close to a side door that led into the exercise yard. Inside, a female German shepherd lay with her body angled toward that door. She was old, maybe 10, with a silvered muzzle and the heavy stillness of a dog that had already learned too much about disappointment. She did not bark. She did not rise. She did not even look at him right away. Her head rested on her paws. Her ears moved just enough to show she knew he was there. Ethan stopped. Rachel noticed. Her voice softened. "That's Juno." The dog's eyes shifted then, slowly, not with excitement, not with hope, but with caution. Ethan had seen that look before in people sitting on the edge of bad news. People who were tired of being told to wait. People who had stopped expecting the door to open for them. "How long has she been here?" he asked. 3 months. Ethan turned slightly. 3 months? Rachel nodded. She came in before the cannery dogs. Different case. Someone found her near a rural road outside Warrenton. No collar, no chip. She had signs of being bred many times. She's healthy enough now, but she's older. And people— Rachel exhaled quietly. People say they love German shepherds until they meet one who moves slowly. Juno remained by the door, as if the conversation had nothing to do with her. Yet Ethan felt she was listening to every word. Rachel continued. "When visitors come through, she stands up, very straight, very polite, like she's trying to prove she won't be a problem. But the minute they pass her by, she goes right back to that spot. By the door. Always by the door." Ethan looked at the latch, then at the narrow rubber mat beneath it. The place where Juno lay was not the softest place in the kennel. There was a blanket in the corner, folded clean and dry. There was a raised cot against the wall, but Juno had chosen the threshold, the cold strip between staying and leaving. He did not ask why. Some things did not need to be explained. Rachel opened a folder clipped to the kennel door. "She's gentle, quiet, walks well, doesn't guard food, doesn't complain about anything." A faint sadness passed over her face. That might be part of the problem. Ethan understood what she meant. Sometimes the quiet ones were easy to overlook. They did not demand rescue loudly enough. He crouched a few feet from the kennel, careful not to crowd her. "Hey, Juno." The old dog's eyes came to him again. She did not wag her tail. She did not shrink back either. She simply watched, as if trying to decide whether his voice was safe. Ethan held out the back of his hand near the bars, not pushing it through. Rain tapped on the roof above them. Somewhere behind him, a younger dog barked twice, then settled. Juno lifted her head. It was a small movement, almost nothing. But Rachel saw it too, because her breath caught softly. "She doesn't usually do that," she said. Ethan kept still. No, not for strangers." The word strangers touched something in him. These days, Ethan sometimes felt like a stranger even in his own kitchen. 2 years earlier, his wife had died after a sudden illness that had moved faster than any prayer, any doctor, any promise he tried to make. Her name had been Claire. She had been the person who opened windows in the morning, left notes on the fridge, and insisted that soup could fix at least half of life's problems. After she was gone, the house changed. Not all at once. That would have been easier to understand. It changed room by room, habit by habit. The porch light stayed off more often. The dining table became a place for unopened mail. The second coffee mug remained in the cabinet until dust gathered at the rim. Ethan still came home every evening, but he did not truly arrive. He entered the house the way some people enter a waiting room. Across the street from him lived Evelyn Richardson, a 72-year-old retired elementary school teacher who treated the neighborhood like an unfinished classroom. She noticed everything: whose trash cans stayed out too long, which children needed extra mittens, whose porch looked too dark at dinner. For months, she had been leaving containers of soup at Ethan's door: chicken and rice, tomato basil, beef stew when the weather turned cold. She never knocked unless she had to. She simply left the food with a note that said, "Eat while warm." Ethan always brought it inside. He always returned the container clean, but he ate alone, standing sometimes at the kitchen counter, because sitting at the table felt too much like admitting no one else was coming. Now, kneeling in front of Juno's kennel, he had the strange thought that she and Evelyn would understand each other. Evelyn kept offering warmth to a man who did not know how to accept it. Juno kept lying by a door, ready for a leaving that had not yet happened. Rachel let the silence sit for a moment before speaking. "She deserves better than this place." Ethan rose slowly. "Most of them do." "Yes," Rachel said, "but some still believe better is coming." "Juno doesn't." He looked down at the old dog. Juno had lowered her head again, but her eyes remained open. She was not asleep. She was waiting. That was the word that came to him, waiting not with faith, but with preparation. Ethan stepped back. "I should finish up." Rachel nodded, though disappointment passed quickly across her face. She had not asked him to adopt Juno. She was too professional for that, but hope had a way of showing itself even when people tried to hide it. They walked back toward the front desk. Ethan signed the last page of the report, tucked his copy into a folder, and thanked Rachel for her time. He told himself that was the end of it. He had work to do. A quiet house was not a reason to take in a dog. Loneliness was not a plan. Grief was not a qualification. He put on his cap, opened the shelter door, and stepped into the rain. For 3 steps, he kept walking. Then he stopped. Behind him, through the glass panel in the door, he could see down the kennel hallway. Juno had stood up. She was not barking. She was not pawing at the gate. She was simply standing in the narrow space near her door, watching him leave. There was no pleading in her face. That was what broke him. A younger dog might have whined. A bolder one might have jumped. Juno only watched with the weary calm of someone who had seen this ending before and had learned not to make a sound. Ethan's hand tightened around the folder. He thought of Evelyn's soup cooling on his porch. He thought of his dark house. He thought of all the doors he had walked through without letting anyone follow. Then he turned around. Rachel looked up from the desk when he came back in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan cleared his throat. "What does the adoption process look like for an older dog?" Rachel's face changed so carefully it almost made him smile. Shelter workers knew better than to celebrate too soon. Hope, for them, had to stand on paperwork. "It starts with an application," she said. "Then a home check. Vet references if you have them. A senior dog like Juno may need patience." "I have a house," Ethan said. "Fenced yard, quiet street, no other pets." Rachel studied him. "And patience?" He looked down the hall again. Juno had not moved from the kennel door. "I'm learning," he said. Rachel went behind the desk and pulled out the form. Ethan took the pen. The questions were ordinary: name, address, employment, household members, experience with dogs. Where would the dog sleep? How many hours would the dog be alone? He answered slowly, honestly. When he reached the line about why he wanted to adopt Juno, he paused. The simple answer was that he could not walk away. But that sounded too small for what had happened in him. At last he wrote, because she should not have to spend the rest of her life waiting by a door. Rachel read the line when he handed the form back. Her eyes softened, but she did not make a speech. She only nodded once. "I'll process this today," she said. "If everything clears, we can schedule the home visit." Ethan glanced toward the kennel hallway. "Can I see her one more time before I go?" "Of course." This time, Rachel opened the kennel door just enough to step inside with him. Juno stood, stiff at first, her body unsure of what was being asked. Ethan crouched again. He did not reach for her. He waited. After a long moment, Juno took one step forward, then another. Her nose moved near his sleeve, gathering the scent of rain, wool, and a man who had not expected to need anyone that morning. Ethan stayed still until her forehead came close to his hand. Only then did he touch her, lightly, just between the ears. Juno closed her eyes. It lasted no more than a second, but it changed the room. When Ethan left the shelter for the second time, the rain had not stopped. The cannery across the road still looked abandoned. The harbor was still hidden in mist. Nothing outside seemed different at all. But inside. Harbor light. Juno no longer lay flat against the door. She sat beside it, watching the entrance. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan drove home with the porch light in his mind already switched on. The adoption went through on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky that looked as if it had forgotten how to clear. Ethan brought Juno home in the back seat of his personal truck, not in the patrol vehicle, because something about that felt gentler. Rachel had given him a folder with medical notes, feeding instructions, and a small bag of the food Juno already knew. She had also placed one hand on the old dog's shoulder before they left and whispered, "This is a good one, girl." Juno had not wagged her tail. She had only looked from Rachel to Ethan, then toward the shelter door, as if memorizing one more place she might never see again. At the house, Ethan opened the truck door and waited. Juno stepped down carefully, one paw at a time, her joints stiff from age and the damp air. The small house stood on a quiet street a few blocks from the water, with a narrow porch, a fenced backyard, and a porch light Ethan had turned on before leaving that morning. It was still daylight, so the light was unnecessary, but he had done it anyway. For the first time in months, he had wanted the house to look as though someone was expected. Juno stood at the edge of the walkway and studied the place. She did not pull toward it. She did not resist either. She simply waited for Ethan to decide what came next. He kept his voice low. "Come on, Juno. Let's go inside." The words sounded ordinary, but to Ethan they felt heavier than they should have. He had said them into an empty house for too long. Now, for the first time, there was someone there to hear him. Inside, he had prepared more than he wanted to admit. A new dog bed waited in the corner of the living room near the old fireplace. 2 bowls sat on a mat in the kitchen. A few toys, chosen awkwardly from the pet store aisle, rested in a basket beside the sofa. There was a soft rope toy, a rubber ball, and a stuffed duck with a face so cheerful it seemed to be overdoing its job. Ethan had almost put the duck back twice, then bought it because he imagined Claire laughing at him for taking dog toys so seriously. Juno stepped through the doorway and froze. Her nose moved, gathering the scent of wood polish, coffee, old paper, and quiet rooms. She looked at the bowls. She looked at the bed. She looked at Ethan. Then she lowered her head and moved into the kitchen. Not the living room, not the warm corner near the fireplace, but the kitchen, where the back door stood closed against the rain. Ethan followed at a distance. "That's all right," he said softly. "You can look around." Juno did not look around. She stood beside the back door for several seconds, turned in a small circle, and lay down on the hard floor, with her body facing the exit. Her front paws stretched toward the threshold. Her ears remained alert. She was not resting. She was placing herself where leaving would be easy. Ethan stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, watching her. Part of him wanted to move the bed right away, to show her the softer place, the safer place. But he remembered the kennel. He remembered how she had lain by the door not because it was comfortable, but because it made sense to a dog who had learned that comfort could disappear without warning. So he left her there. That first evening, Juno ate everything in her bowl, slowly but completely. She drank water, accepted one short walk around the block, and returned to the house without resistance. She did not bark when a car passed. She did not sniff at the toy basket. She did not step onto the rug in the living room until Ethan called her, and even then she stopped after 2 steps, as if the room belonged to someone else. "It's just a room," Ethan said, trying to make his voice light. "Not a courtroom." Juno blinked at him. He almost smiled. "Fair enough. Bad joke." She turned and went back to the kitchen. By 9 that night, Ethan had moved the new dog bed from the living room to the kitchen. He placed it 6 feet from the back door, angled so Juno could still see the exit. He patted the cushion once. "For you." Juno looked at the bed with a deep suspicion. Then she lowered herself onto the floor beside it. Ethan did not push. He turned off the lights, left a small lamp glowing over the stove, and went upstairs. For the first time in years, he found himself listening for another living creature in the house. The click of nails against tile. A slow breath. The faint shift of a body turning in sleep. It should have comforted him. Instead, it made him aware of how still the house had been before. In the morning, the bed remained untouched. Juno was on the floor by the back door, awake before him, watching the kitchen as though guarding a place she did not yet believe belonged to her. Ethan made coffee, poured her breakfast, and set a treat beside the bowl. She ate the food and carried the treat carefully to the edge of her blanket. Then, when Ethan looked away, she tucked it under the fabric with her nose. He saw it, but pretended not to. Over the next week, Juno learned the schedule quickly. Breakfast at 6. A short walk before Ethan left for work. A longer walk after he came home. Dinner at 5:30. She understood doorways, sidewalks, food bowls, and the sound of Ethan's truck pulling into the driveway. But she did not understand gifts. Toys remained untouched. Treats vanished under blankets. Praise made her lower her head, not because she disliked it, but because she did not seem to know what to do with kindness that asked nothing in return. Ethan began to understand that Juno's silence was not obedience. It was caution. She was not trying to be perfect because she was naturally calm. She was trying to be perfect because, somewhere in her past, taking up space had cost her something. On Thursday afternoon, Evelyn appeared on Ethan's porch with a tin of biscuits wrapped in a dish towel and a request in her voice before she even spoke. "I need a favor," she said. Ethan opened the door wider. Juno stood behind him, half hidden in the hall. Evelyn's eyes softened when she saw the dog, but she did not rush forward. "Well, hello there, Juno. I've heard about you." Ethan glanced at her. "From who?" "From the porch light," Evelyn said matter-of-factly. "It has been on 3 evenings in a row. Something changed." Ethan shook his head, but there was no real irritation in it. "What's the favor?" Evelyn explained that the front railing at the community house had come loose again. The building was a modest old place near the church, used for neighborhood gatherings, donated coats in winter, and the Thursday dinners Evelyn organized for older residents who lived alone. She had called the city office, but repairs were slow, and several of her regular guests leaned on that railing when they climbed the steps. "I could tape a warning sign on it," she said, "but Harold will ignore it, Martha will scold it, and Mr. Bell will try to fix it with a butter knife. I would prefer all 3 of them survive dinner." Ethan looked down at Juno. "I have tools in the garage." That sounded almost like yes. It was close enough. He told himself he was going because the railing was a safety issue. That was true. It was also true that Evelyn had been feeding half the lonely people in town for years, including him, whether he admitted it or not. Juno rode with him in the truck, quiet as always. At the community house, the rain had stopped, leaving the steps dark and slick. Evelyn pointed out the loose section while Ethan unloaded his toolbox. Inside, voices drifted from the dining room. The guests were already arriving. Harold Ward, 65, a retired postal worker who knew every street in Astoria by memory, stood near the doorway with a cane in one hand and a paper napkin in the other. Martha Ramirez, 69, a widow who volunteered at the library twice a week, was arranging plates with the seriousness of a general preparing for battle. Henry Bell, 74, a former boat mechanic, leaned against the wall and announced that he had fixed railings before, though Evelyn quietly removed the screwdriver from his coat pocket. Juno stayed close to Ethan at first. When the drill started, she flinched but did not run. Ethan paused, let her settle, then continued more slowly. By the time the railing was secure, the smell of chicken stew had filled the building, and Evelyn had somehow convinced Ethan to come inside for just one bowl, a phrase that never meant just one bowl when Evelyn said it. Juno followed him into the dining room and stopped near the wall. Several people turned to look. Ethan felt her body tense beside his leg. He expected questions. He expected someone to say she looked too big, too old, too serious. Instead, Harold lowered himself carefully into a chair and said, "That dog looks like she understands bad weather." Juno looked at him. Harold nodded as if they had reached an agreement. "Thought so?" A few people chuckled. The sound was gentle, not pointed at her. Juno moved to the far corner of the room and lay down, facing the door as always. But this time she was not alone. Harold's chair was nearby. Martha sat a little longer than usual after dinner, telling Evelyn about a book she had just finished. Henry told a story about a fishing boat that may or may not have been true. No one seemed in a hurry to leave. Ethan noticed it slowly. Usually, at gatherings like this, people ate, thanked Evelyn, and returned to their separate houses before the silence there could grow too large. But Juno's presence gave them something easy to talk about. Not illness, not bills, not children who lived far away. A dog. An old dog who asked nothing of them. Harold dropped a crumb by accident. Juno did not move toward it. He looked impressed. "Better manners than me," Martha smiled. "Most creatures have better manners than you, Harold." For a moment, Ethan felt the room warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stew. That night, after he and Juno returned home, he placed her bed a little closer to the back door, not touching it, not crowding her, just closer. Then he made coffee, even though it was late, and sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet. Juno watched him from the tile. "I know," he said quietly. "It's strange here." Her ears moved. "It's strange for me, too." He took a sip of coffee and looked toward the unused bed. No rush. The next night he moved the bed 2 inches closer. The night after that, another 2. Juno continued to sleep on the floor, but she no longer looked alarmed when he touched the bed. Sometimes, while Ethan sat with his coffee, her eyes closed for a few seconds at a time. It was not trust yet. It was the small space before trust. The quiet ledge where fear pauses, not ready to leave, but tired of standing. By Sunday evening, one of the hidden treats had reappeared. Ethan found it sitting beside Juno's bowl, softened around the edges, but uneaten. He did not know whether she had forgotten it, offered it back, or simply decided she did not need to save every good thing for later. He picked it up, broke it in half, and placed both pieces near her paws. Juno lowered her head. For once, she ate one piece immediately. The other she left untouched until Ethan sat down beside her. Then, while rain whispered against the windows and the house held its breath, Juno ate the second piece too. By the third Sunday after Juno came home, the rain finally loosened its grip on Astoria. The clouds still hung low over the roofs, and the air carried the damp chill of the coast, but the sky had opened just enough for a pale afternoon light to fall across Ethan's backyard. It was not warm in the way summer was warm. It was the kind of cool, careful day when people in Oregon stepped outside anyway, grateful for any hour without rain. Ethan had not planned to have anyone over. That was still not something he did easily. But Evelyn had a way of turning small things into gatherings before a person noticed they had agreed. She had come by after church with a covered dish, saying she had made too much potato salad, which Ethan strongly suspected was not true. By 3 o'clock, Harold had appeared with a bag of dinner rolls. Martha brought a jar of pickles she claimed were famous in 3 counties, though no one could name which counties. Henry arrived with a folding chair and a story about a leaky fishing boat, which began as a simple repair job and somehow turned into a near-heroic survival tale by the second cup of coffee. Ethan watched them settle into the yard with a quiet disbelief he did not show on his face. The backyard had not held this many voices in years. It had become a place for mowing, stacking firewood, and letting the seasons pass without asking much from him. Now there were chairs beneath the maple tree, paper plates on a small table, and Evelyn standing near the porch as if she had always known the yard was waiting to become useful again. Juno lay on an old cushion beneath the maple, where the ground stayed mostly dry. Ethan had placed it there earlier when he saw her circling the grass, unsure whether she was allowed to rest near the people or should keep to the edge. The cushion had once belonged to a patio bench, faded and flattened from years of weather, but Juno accepted it more easily than the new bed inside. Perhaps because it looked worn. Perhaps because it did not ask her to believe too much. She watched the small gathering with a stillness that no longer felt quite as fearful. Her ears moved when Harold laughed. Her eyes followed Martha's hands whenever a plate passed by. Once, when Henry dropped a roll and pretended he had done it for scientific purposes, Juno looked toward Ethan first, waiting. Only after Ethan nodded did she rise, take the roll gently, and return to her cushion as if carrying a priceless gift. "That dog has better table manners than half the town," Martha said. Henry lifted a hand. "I accept that as a personal attack." "It was meant as one," she replied. Even Ethan smiled at that. It came softly, not enough to surprise the others, but enough for Evelyn to notice. She noticed everything. She was sitting near the porch steps, hands folded over her knee, watching Ethan with the satisfied patience of a person who watered a plant and did not shout at it to grow. For a while, nothing important happened. That was what made it important. No paperwork, no shelter forms, no old wounds being named out loud. Just neighbors passing food, a dog lying under a tree, and the mild comedy of Henry trying to explain why pickles did not belong on potato salad while eating both. Near 4:30, Noah Ramirez arrived through the side gate carrying a stack of folding trays. He was 15, a high school student who often helped Evelyn set up and clean after community meals. He was a quiet boy, thoughtful in the careful way of someone who had learned to measure words before releasing them. He had a slight stutter that came and went, especially when strangers looked directly at him, so he often chose work over conversation. Chairs, dishes, trays, sweeping floors. Those tasks never asked him to hurry a sentence. Evelyn waved him over. "Noah, sweetheart, set those by the porch. And don't let Henry tell you he invented the fishing net again." Henry turned. "I improved it." "You tangled yourself in it." "That is part of the testing process." Noah gave a small smile and placed the trays down. His gaze moved to Juno, then away quickly, not out of fear, but out of respect. Juno noticed him. Her ears lifted a little. Noah did not approach. Instead, he sat on the bottom porch step with a paperback book sticking out of his jacket pocket. Ethan saw the book. "You reading for school?" Noah looked at him, then at the ground near his shoes. Yes, sir. Supposed to read 2 chapters by tomorrow." "Good book?" Noah considered that honestly. "It has a lot of boats. In this town, that counts as educational." Noah smiled again, a little easier this time. The afternoon moved toward evening. The pale light faded from the grass and the chill came up from the earth, One by one, people began gathering plates and folding napkins. Evelyn stood and announced that if they did not go inside soon, Harold's knees would file an official complaint. Harold said his knees had already formed a committee. Ethan opened the back door and held it while the others carried dishes into the kitchen. Martha went first, then Harold, then Henry, with his folding chair tucked under one arm. Evelyn paused to collect a serving spoon from the table. Noah began stacking the trays again. Juno stood when everyone else stood. Ethan noticed because he had begun to notice all her small decisions. She rose from the cushion, stretched one front leg carefully, and looked toward the open door. For a moment, Ethan expected her to follow. She had been coming inside more easily these past few days, though only when he went first and only if the house was quiet. But then Juno turned away from the porch. She walked toward the fence. Ethan remained by the door, his hand still on the frame. Juno reached the far side of the yard, near the place where the fence met a low hedge. She turned once, then twice, in the small circle dogs make before lying down. Then she lowered herself onto the grass, tucked her paws beneath her, and curled close to the boards as the evening air thickened around her. At first, Ethan's mind tried to make it ordinary. Maybe she liked that spot. Maybe the grass smelled interesting. Maybe the house felt crowded with people carrying plates and talking too loudly. All of those explanations lasted only a few seconds. Then he understood. She was preparing to sleep outside, not because she had been told to, not because she wanted to, because in whatever map fear had drawn inside her, the house belonged to Ethan, and the yard belonged to her. The cushion beneath the maple had been acceptable. The grass near the fence was acceptable. But the door, the warm kitchen, the living room with its quiet lamp and unused bed, those were still privileges she did not trust. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. It was not anger. It was not even sadness in a simple way. It was the shock of seeing how deeply a life could be trained to expect less. Evelyn appeared beside him with the serving spoon in her hand. She followed his gaze. Her face changed, but she did not speak quickly. That was one of her gifts. She knew when words would crowd a fragile moment. Noah had stopped too. He stood near the porch, trays held against his chest, watching Juno without staring too hard. Ethan stepped down onto the grass. "Juno." The old dog lifted her head. Her ears came forward, but she did not rise. He took 2 steps, then stopped. Some part of him wanted to go to her, scoop up the cushion, guide her in, prove with action what words had failed to teach. But he knew force would only make the house feel like another place where decisions were made for her. Juno had spent too much of her life being moved. If she was ever going to belong, she had to be allowed to choose the doorway herself. Ethan turned back to the porch. Without making a performance of it, he picked up the old cushion from beneath the maple and carried it inside. He placed it just beyond the living room rug, not too far from the kitchen, not too close to the center of the room. Then he opened the back door wider and left it open. Cold air drifted in. Martha from the kitchen whispered, "Should we help?" Evelyn answered softly, "No, let him do it his way." Ethan sat on the floor near the cushion, his back against the arm of the sofa. He did not call again. He did not pat the floor. He did not promise what Juno could not yet believe. He simply waited where she could see him. For several minutes, nothing moved except the thin curtains near the door. Outside, Juno remained curled by the fence. Inside, the neighbors kept unusually quiet. Even Henry seemed to understand that this was not a moment for commentary, which may have been the nearest thing to a miracle the house had seen all week. Then Noah moved. He set the trays down beside Evelyn and took the paperback from his pocket. He did not ask permission. He did not walk toward Juno. He sat on the floor a few feet from Ethan, angled toward the open door but not directly facing the dog. After a brief pause, he opened the book. His voice began unevenly. "The boat waited at the edge of the water." He stopped, swallowed, and started again. The boat waited at the edge of the water, tied to a post that had seen too many storms. The words entered the room gently, not loud, not polished, just steady enough to be followed. Noah kept reading, and because he was looking at the page instead of at anyone's face, the stutter softened. His voice found a rhythm. A boat, a dock, a boy in a storm, a lantern burning in a window. The story inside the book was simple, but in that room it became something else. It became a bridge made of sound. Juno lifted her head higher. Ethan did not move. Noah read another paragraph. Outside, Juno unfolded one front leg. Her body remained low, but her attention had changed. She was no longer watching only Ethan. She was listening to Noah, this boy who also seemed to understand the burden of being observed too closely. A minute passed, then another. At last, Juno stood. She did not come in quickly. She crossed the yard one careful step at a time, as if the grass might object to her leaving it. At the porch, she paused. Her nose moved in the cold air. Her eyes shifted from Ethan to Noah, then to the cushion lying just inside the living room. Noah kept reading. He did not celebrate. He did not look up. His voice carried on, soft but clear. Juno placed one paw on the threshold. Ethan's throat tightened, but he stayed still. The second paw followed, then the third. Then, with a tired little breath, Juno stepped into the house. No one clapped. No one gasped. Evelyn pressed one hand gently to her chest, but even she said nothing. Juno stood just inside the door for several seconds. Then she walked to the cushion, turned in a circle, and lay down. Not by the fence, not outside, inside. Ethan lowered his gaze to her. "You're home, Juno," he said quietly. Her eyes remained open, uncertain but calmer than before. "I know," he added. "It may take a while." Noah's voice slowed as he reached the end of the page. When he finished, he rested the book in his lap. Juno looked at him, and for the first time that evening, her tail moved once against the cushion. A small sound, barely more than a brush against fabric, but everyone heard it. Noah smiled down at the book, as if the page had given him the gift. Later, after the dishes were washed and the neighbors had gone, Ethan found himself standing in the living room doorway. The house was quiet again, but not empty in the old way. Juno was asleep on the old cushion, not the new bed, not yet, but inside the room where people had gathered. Her body still angled slightly toward the door, but she was not pressed against it. Ethan turned off the kitchen light and left the small lamp burning near the sofa. For Juno, perhaps the house did not belong to her yet, but that night, for the first time, she had crossed the threshold without being pulled. And Ethan understood that sometimes healing did not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came on old Paws through an open door, while a boy read softly enough for fear to listen. The first real piece of Juno's past arrived on a Wednesday morning, folded inside a thin envelope that looked too ordinary for the weight it carried. Ethan found it waiting at the front desk of the police station after his early patrol, with Rachel's name written across a note clipped to the front. She had called twice before he reached his desk, but he had been helping an elderly man whose car had stalled near the bridge, so the message sat there quietly, like bad weather waiting beyond a closed window. When Ethan called her back, Rachel did not waste time with small talk. "I found something," she said. Her voice was calm but careful. "Not everything, just enough to explain some of what we've been seeing." Ethan looked toward the rain-streaked window beside his desk. "About Juno?" "Yes. I think you should come by when you can." He went during his lunch break, though he did not eat. Harbor Light was quieter than usual that day. A few dogs barked when he entered, then settled as Rachel led him into her office. She had a folder open on the desk. Several pages had been copied from old veterinary intake forms, ownership transfer notes, and complaint records that had passed through different hands over the years. Rachel sat down slowly. "Before you read this, I want you to know she's safe now." Ethan did not answer right away. He knew people said that when the past was ugly enough to make the present feel fragile. Rachel turned one page toward him. Juno used to belong to a breeding operation outside the county. The owner was listed as Frank Evans. Frank Evans was 58, the owner of a private dog breeding facility that had operated for years under a clean name and a polished sign. In public records, the place looked orderly enough. Permits, sales listings, basic inspection notes, nothing dramatic at first glance. But the older documents Rachel had uncovered told a different story in pieces. Juno had been moved between locations. She had given birth to several litters. At least twice she had undergone surgery after complicated births, and the notes suggested that the procedures had not been handled with the care a living creature deserved. Ethan read the pages once, then again, because part of him wanted to believe he had misunderstood. The words were plain, too plain. They did not shout. They simply recorded dates, weights, wounds, breeding cycles, recovery notes, and transfers. The coldness of it made his hands tighten on the paper. "She was used," Rachel said softly, "over and over. When she could no longer produce the way they wanted, she was passed along. Different names appear after that. None of them kept her long." Ethan lowered the page. "And then she ended up on the road. That's what it looks like." For a moment, the office seemed too small. Ethan had dealt with neglect before. He had seen houses where animals were forgotten in yards, seen people make excuses for cruelty, because cruelty rarely introduced itself honestly. But Juno had been lying in his kitchen, hiding treats under a blanket, asking permission to exist, and somewhere on these pages was the answer to why. Anger rose in him, quick and hot. It would have been easy to let it fill the room, easy to say Frank's name like a sentence, easy to imagine every door at that breeding facility opened and every record laid bare beneath a brighter light. Rachel watched him carefully. "Ethan." He looked at her. "I know what you're thinking, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be consequences. There should be. But Juno doesn't need your anger when you go home today." The words landed where they needed to. Ethan set the pages down. He took a slow breath. "No, she doesn't. She needs what you're already doing," Rachel said. "Same food, same voice, same door opening again and again without someone sending her away." It sounded too small after everything in that file. Feed her on time. Walk her on the same street. Speak gently before leaving. Come back when expected. But Ethan had learned in police work that some of the largest repairs began with ordinary acts repeated long enough to become believable. He asked Rachel for copies of the documents. Not because he planned to bring the storm home to Juno, but because storms still needed to be tracked. Rachel agreed. She would continue looking for missing pieces, and Ethan would pass the records through the proper channel without making promises he could not yet keep. That evening, when Ethan came home, Juno was waiting by the kitchen doorway. Not pressed against the back door this time, but near it. That difference was small enough that another person might have missed it. Ethan did not. She lifted her head when he entered. Her tail moved once, then stopped as if she had surprised herself. "I'm home," he said. He had started saying it every time he returned. At first it felt strange, speaking to a quiet house and a dog who did not quite believe him. Now it had become part of the door itself. Key in lock. Hinges opening. His voice. "I'm home." Juno watched him hang up his jacket. He did not kneel and gather her into his arms. He did not tell her he was sorry for things he had not done and could not undo. Instead, he washed his hands, filled her bowl, measured the same amount of food he gave her every evening, and placed it in the same spot on the kitchen mat. "Dinner," he said. Juno came to the bowl and ate. That was the first promise of the night. After dinner they walked their usual route. Down Maple Street, past Evelyn's house, around the corner where the wind came sharper from the river, and back along the sidewalk with the cracked curb. The route was not special, but that was the point. Juno could learn its edges. She could learn that the blue house with the wind chimes came before the mailbox with the painted gull. She could learn that the porch with the yellow chair meant they were nearly home. Evelyn was outside when they passed, sweeping leaves from her steps, though the wind clearly intended to return them. "You two are right on time," she called. Ethan gave her a small wave. Trying to be. Juno paused. Evelyn did not approach quickly. She had learned the old dog's pace by now. Instead, she rested both hands on the top of the broom and spoke as though Juno were an old neighbor returning from the store. "Good evening, Juno. I saved a biscuit for you, but Ethan can decide whether I'm spoiling you." "You are," Ethan said. "Then I'm doing it correctly." Juno took the biscuit only after Ethan nodded. She carried it for nearly half a block before eating it. Ethan watched her chew, slow and cautious, as if even pleasure should be handled respectfully. At home, he made coffee and sat in his chair near the living room lamp. Juno entered after him. She circled once near the doorway, then walked toward the rug. For several weeks, she had stayed on the edge of the room, body pointed toward whichever exit was closest. Tonight, she came nearer to Ethan's chair and lay down a few feet away. Her head still faced the door, but her body was closer to him. Ethan let the moment remain quiet. He opened a book but did not read much. His eyes kept drifting to Juno. The folder from Rachel lay in his locked desk drawer, out of sight. He did not need to look at it again to remember what it said. The scars had already been in front of him. The papers had only translated them. On Friday afternoon, Noah came by with Evelyn after school. It had become a small routine, though no one had officially named it. Evelyn said she needed help carrying a few donated books to the community house. Noah brought them, stayed for lemonade, then somehow ended up on Ethan's living room floor with Juno lying nearby and his paperback open in his hands. At first, Noah read only short passages, a few sentences, then a pause. When his words caught, he would close his mouth, look down, and try again. Ethan never corrected him. Evelyn never rushed him. Juno did not shift impatiently or stare in confusion. She simply listened with the grave attention of a creature who knew what it meant to be afraid of making the wrong sound. That Friday, Noah read nearly a full page before stopping. Evelyn looked up from the kitchen table where she had been sorting donation receipts. Her eyes moved from Noah to Juno, and something in her face softened with quiet understanding. "Well," she said gently, "look at that." Noah lowered the book. "I messed up twice." "Only twice?" Ethan said. "I mess up more than that reading grocery labels." Noah laughed under his breath, then looked quickly toward Juno as if to see whether the sound had startled her. It had not. Her eyes were half closed, her chin resting on her paws. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "She doesn't mind waiting for you." Noah looked at Juno for a long moment. "I think she knows." No one asked him to explain. They did not need to. Some understanding does not travel through perfect sentences. The weekly reading continued after that. Every few days, Noah would sit a little nearer, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that Juno could hear the softness beneath the words. He read stories about boats, lost children, brave horses, and one very stubborn goose that made Evelyn laugh so hard she had to wipe her eyes with a napkin. Juno never laughed, of course, but once when Noah stumbled over a word and sighed in frustration, she lifted her head and touched her nose to the corner of his shoe. Noah froze. Then he smiled. After that, he finished the paragraph. Ethan noticed that Juno began to change in ways so small they felt almost secret. She stopped hiding every treat. Some she still tucked under the blanket, but others she ate while Ethan remained in the room. She began to follow him from the kitchen to the living room without waiting to be called. When he put on his uniform in the morning, she no longer retreated to the back door. She watched him from the hallway, uncertain, but not trembling. Each morning before leaving, Ethan crouched near her and spoke the same words. "I'm going to work. I'll come back." The first time he said it, it felt foolish. By the 10th time, it felt necessary. By the 20th, Juno seemed to know the shape of it. Not believe it completely, but recognize it as part of the day. At noon, if his shift allowed, Ethan came home for 10 minutes. He did not do anything dramatic. He refilled water, let Juno into the yard, scratched her head if she came close, then left again with the same goodbye. He wanted her to learn that leaving did not always mean disappearing. One evening, after a long shift, he came home later than usual. The sky was dark, and rain tapped against the porch roof. He expected to find Juno at the back door, tense and waiting. Instead, she was lying beside his chair in the living room. Her head lifted when he entered, and she watched him with worried eyes, but she had not returned to the kitchen floor. Ethan stood still for a moment, the house key still in his hand. "I'm home," he said, softer than usual. Juno rose slowly and came to him. She did not jump. She did not bark. She pressed her forehead lightly against his knee, then stepped back as though uncertain whether that was allowed. Ethan placed one hand on her head. "That's allowed," he whispered. Later that night, he sat in the kitchen with his coffee while Juno lay near the doorway to the living room, not fully in one room or the other. She still liked thresholds. Perhaps she always would. But now, sometimes, those thresholds were not places to wait for abandonment. Sometimes they were places where one world met another. The anger he had felt in Rachel's office had not vanished. It remained, but it had changed shape. It no longer burned wild in his chest. It had become a steadier thing, a quiet promise that the truth would not be ignored. Frank Evans and every person who had treated Juno like a tool deserved to answer for what they had done. Ethan believed that deeply. But Juno did not need revenge served in her bowl each morning. She needed breakfast at 6, a walk down Maple Street, a biscuit from Evelyn, Noah's careful voice reading one more page, a lamp left on in the living room, a man who said goodbye and came back. So that was what Ethan gave her. Day by day, in ordinary hours that would never make a report or a headline, Juno began to understand the first language of home. Not grand gestures, not promises shouted into the dark, just the same kindness, returning again and again, until even an old wounded heart began to wonder whether it might be safe to stay. For a while, Ethan allowed himself to believe that the house had learned a new kind of breathing. It was late February by then, and Astoria still wore its gray mornings like an old coat, but the days were beginning to stretch. The rain came softer. The wind off the river no longer sounded quite so lonely against the windows. Inside Ethan's house, the changes were small enough that a stranger might not have noticed them, but to him they felt almost impossible. Juno no longer slept with her body pressed against the back door. Some nights she chose the rug near the living room lamp. Sometimes she followed Ethan from room to room without waiting to be invited. Once, when he had dropped a dish towel and muttered at himself, she had picked it up carefully and carried it to him, as if returning a lost flag from a very small battlefield. That was the moment Ethan had laughed. It surprised him so much that he stopped in the middle of the kitchen with the towel in his hand. The sound had come out rough, unused, almost foreign. Juno had looked up at him with the towel still partly between her teeth, unsure whether she had done something wrong. Ethan crouched and scratched behind her ears. "No, girl," he said, still smiling. "That was good. That was very good." After that, laughter began to find little cracks in the house. Not often, not loudly, but enough. It came when Juno tried to understand the stuffed duck and seemed personally offended by its squeak. It came when Evelyn brought over a casserole and declared that a dog who did not beg at the table was clearly more civilized than several men she had known. It came when Noah read a chapter about a runaway goat, and Juno lifted her head at every mention of the goat as though waiting for it to appear in the hallway. The old wounds were still there. Ethan knew that. Juno still hid some treats. She still watched the door when he put on his uniform. She still slept lighter on stormy nights. But she had begun to trust the rhythm of the days. Breakfast, walk, goodbye, return, dinner, lamp, voice, the same kindness again and again. One Saturday afternoon, that trust showed itself in a way Ethan had not expected. He was in the backyard, stacking a few loose branches near the fence after a night of wind. Juno stood by the maple tree, sniffing at the damp grass. The old cushion was still there, though it had become more of a resting place than a boundary. Near the porch steps lay a faded rubber ball Ethan had bought the first week she came home. It had spent months ignored in the toy basket, then on the porch, then in the yard where rain and neglect had softened its bright color. Ethan bent to pick up another branch when something rolled against his boot. He looked down. The ball rested there, wet with grass. Juno stood a few feet away, ears forward, tail low but moving. For a second, Ethan did not understand. Then he looked from the ball to Juno and felt his chest tighten with something so tender it almost hurt. "You brought this to me?" Juno took one stiff step backward, as if unsure whether the offer had been accepted. Ethan picked up the ball slowly. "All right," he said, "not too far." He tossed it gently across the yard. Juno did not chase it like a young dog. She lumbered after it, awkward and careful, her back legs not as quick as they once might have been. Halfway there, she seemed to reconsider the whole idea, then continued with a burst of determination that made Ethan laugh before he could stop himself. She reached the ball, nosed it once, picked it up, and came trotting back in a crooked line, proud and embarrassed at the same time. Ethan clapped his hands once, softly. "That's it, Juno. That's my girl." She dropped the ball at his feet. He threw it again, then again. Only a few times, because she was older and he would not ask too much. But for those few minutes, under the pale light of an Oregon afternoon, Juno was not a discarded breeding dog, not a frightened animal waiting by a door, not a record in Rachel's folder. She was simply a dog in a yard, carrying a ball to the man who had come back enough times for her to believe he might throw it again. Ethan laughed so openly that Evelyn, who had been walking past the fence with a cloth grocery bag in one hand, stopped and peered over the gate. "Well," she called, "listen to that. I was beginning to think your laugh had moved to another state." Ethan shook his head, still smiling. Juno found it. Evelyn looked at the old dog, who was now standing with the ball in her mouth and a look of solemn achievement. Of course she did. Dogs are excellent at finding things people misplace. That evening, Juno surprised him again. After dinner, instead of settling near the kitchen doorway, she walked into the living room and lay down beside the sofa. Not beside the back door, not halfway between rooms. Beside the sofa, close enough that Ethan could reach down and touch her without moving from his seat. He did not make a grand moment of it. He had learned that Juno trusted quiet better than celebration. He only rested his hand on her shoulder while the old lamp filled the room with warm light. Outside, rain began again, gentle against the windows. Ethan looked down at her and let himself think it. Maybe the worst was behind them. The next morning proved how dangerous that thought could be. The call came before dawn. A widower named Martin Hale, 78 years old and a retired dock worker who still insisted on taking morning walks near the river, had not returned home. His daughter had called the station after finding his coat missing and his medication untouched on the kitchen counter. The temperature had dropped overnight. Fog had settled low along the river road. Ethan was already in uniform when the dispatcher gave the details. He crouched near Juno, who had risen from the rug and was watching him carefully. "I have to go to work," he said, using the words she knew. "I'll come back." She held his gaze. "I'll come back," he repeated. He called Evelyn from the truck and asked if she could check on Juno if the search ran long. Evelyn said yes before he finished the sentence. By 7, officers, volunteers, and firefighters were searching the river path, the old rail spur, and the brush near the cannery road. The fog made everything slower. Voices carried strangely. Footprints disappeared into mud and gravel. Ethan moved from one search point to another, keeping his voice calm for Martin's daughter while time pressed harder against everyone. By noon, there was still no sign. By evening, the rain returned. Evelyn went to Ethan's house twice that day. The first time, Juno accepted water but left her food untouched. The second time, Evelyn found her sitting near the front window, staring toward the street. She coaxed her gently, offered a biscuit, and even sat with her on the living room floor, but Juno would not settle. Near midnight, after Ethan called to say he still could not leave the search, Evelyn went back again. This time, Juno was not by the window. The back door was unlocked, not open, but unlocked from where Evelyn had let her out earlier. Juno had pushed through the storm flap and gone into the yard. Evelyn found her sitting beside the front gate in the rain, facing the street. "Oh, sweetheart," Evelyn whispered. Juno did not turn. Evelyn put on Ethan's old raincoat from the hook and stepped outside. "He's coming back. You know that, don't you?" The rain ran down Juno's ears. She sat still, too tired to tremble, too frightened to leave the gate. Evelyn brought a towel. Juno would not follow her inside. She would not eat. She only watched the road with the terrible patience of a heart that had learned one happy day could vanish by morning. Evelyn stayed with her as long as she could, sitting beneath the porch roof with a blanket around her shoulders, speaking now and then in a low voice. But Juno remained at the gate until the dark began to thin. Ethan returned just after sunrise. The search had ended safely. Martin Hale had been found in a storage shed near the river, confused and cold, but alive. Relief should have filled Ethan completely, and for a moment it did. Then he turned onto his street and saw Juno by the gate. His truck slowed. Juno lifted her head. She did not run to him. She did not bark. She did not leap with joy. She simply stood, took one step forward, and then sank down onto the wet ground as if her legs could no longer hold the weight of all she had expected. Ethan was out of the truck before he fully stopped. He knelt in the rain beside her, his uniform soaked at the knees, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I'm here," he said. "Juno, I'm here." She pressed her head low, not against him at first, but toward the ground, as if surrendering to exhaustion. He felt how cold she was, how tired, how long she must have held herself ready for bad news. Evelyn came out onto the porch, wrapped in her blanket, her face pale with worry. She waited all night. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Not because he blamed Evelyn, not because he blamed Juno, because he understood, with a pain that moved through him slowly, that healing had not erased the old fear. It had only taught Juno to hope, and hope, when frightened, could hurt more than numbness. He wrapped the towel around Juno and helped her inside. She walked slowly, leaning against his leg. In the kitchen he dried her with care, warmed a bowl of food with a little broth, and sat beside her while she ate a few bites. Then he brought her blanket to the living room and lowered himself to the floor. Juno lay down with her head on his boot. For a long while, Ethan did not move. Later that morning, Evelyn told him about the notice that had arrived at the community house. Participation numbers were too low. Funding could be reduced. If things did not change, the Thursday dinners might have to end. Ethan listened while stroking Juno's damp fur. The news should have felt separate, but it did not. Too many people in town were waiting by their own gates, he thought. Too many were pretending they did not need anyone to come back. Noah arrived after school, carrying his book and a folded sheet of paper. He had heard about the notice from Evelyn and had been thinking all day. He stood in Ethan's living room, nervous but determined. What if... He stopped, then tried again. What if people came to read to the rescue dogs? Kids, older people, families. They could come to the community house first, then the shelter maybe, or the shelter could bring one calm dog. People might come if they felt useful. Evelyn looked at him with bright eyes. Noah Ramirez, that is not just an idea. That is a door. Ethan looked down at Juno, who had lifted her head at Noah's voice. A door. Juno knew something about doors. So did Ethan. So did every person who had almost stopped knocking. That evening, Juno did not sleep beside the sofa. She returned to the kitchen doorway, closer to the exit than she had been the night before. Ethan felt the old disappointment rise, but he let it pass. He understood now. This was not failure. This was the road bending back before moving forward again. He sat on the kitchen floor with his coffee, close enough for her to hear him breathe. I came back, he said softly. Juno's eyes moved to him. And tomorrow, he added, we'll start again. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the house stayed lit. And, though Juno's head still faced the door, her paws rested near Ethan's knee. That was enough for one night. By early March, the first reading afternoon at the community house had become more than Noah's idea on a folded sheet of paper. Evelyn had turned it into a notice on the bulletin board. Rachel had approved one calm shelter dog for the first visit. Ethan had agreed to bring Juno, though only after reminding everyone that Juno was not a showpiece, not a mascot, and not there to be crowded by eager hands. She was simply an old dog learning that rooms full of people did not always mean danger. The morning of the event, Ethan brushed Juno on the back porch while gulls called over the rooftops and the river wind moved through the maple branches. Juno stood still beneath his hand, her eyes half closed, her body quieter than it had been the week after his overnight search. She had recovered from that long night by the gate, but not all at once. For several days afterward, she had returned to sleeping near the kitchen doorway. Ethan had not treated it like failure. He had moved his coffee back to the floor, said goodbye before work, and came home when he promised. Slowly, Juno had followed him toward the living room again. Big day, Ethan said, working the brush gently along her back. Juno turned her head as if measuring whether big days were safe. I know, he said. We'll take it slow. They reached the community house a little after noon. The front railing Ethan had repaired held firm beneath the hands of older guests and nervous parents. Inside, Evelyn had arranged chairs in a wide half-circle, leaving plenty of space near the wall for Juno to settle if she wanted distance. Noah placed books on a table near the door, sorting them into small piles. Animal stories, adventure stories, picture books, and one stack he called Books with Boats, because he believed every respectable room in Astoria needed at least a few. Grace Powell arrived holding Evelyn's hand. Grace was 9 years old, Evelyn's granddaughter, and a third-grade student who loved books more than recess and treated animals with the careful seriousness some adults never learned. She had come to help pass out bookmarks, though the moment she saw Juno, her steps slowed. She's bigger than I thought, Grace whispered. She is, Evelyn said, and gentler than some teacups I've owned. Grace frowned. Teacups can't be gentle. You never met my Aunt Ruth's teacups, very judgmental. Grace giggled, then looked at Ethan. Can I say hello? Ethan appreciated the question more than she knew. Not yet. Let her get used to the room first. Grace nodded, accepting that as if it were a sacred rule. For the first half hour, things went better than Ethan expected. A few children read softly from picture books. Harold listened to a boy stumble through a story about a lost puppy and declared at the end that the puppy had better sense than most politicians. Martha corrected his posture twice. Henry told a child that reading to dogs improved boat repairs, which no one could prove false quickly enough to stop him. Juno lay beside Ethan's chair, not asleep, but calm. Her head turned when pages rustled. Her ears moved when Noah read a short passage to a little girl who was too shy to begin. The room did not heal all at once, but it softened. People who had once hurried through meals now lingered over stories. Parents who had never spoken to older neighbors found themselves laughing at the same lines. The program was small, almost fragile, but it had begun to do exactly what Noah hoped. It gave lonely people and uncertain children a reason to sit in the same room without feeling foolish. Then, near the end of the hour, one father by the refreshment table folded his arms and said what others had only been thinking. "I don't know about having a German Shepherd around children," he said. The room quieted, not completely, but enough. The man was not cruel in tone. He sounded worried, and worry could be stubborn when it wore the mask of responsibility. Another woman nodded beside him. "They're powerful dogs. You hear stories." Ethan felt Juno tense at his side, responding not to the words, but to the shift in the room. He placed one hand lightly near her shoulder. He wanted to defend her. He wanted to tell them how many nights she had trembled at the sound of a raised voice, how carefully she took biscuits, how she had never once pushed toward a child. But he had learned that some truths were not best carried by argument. Before he could speak, Grace walked to the open space near Juno. She did not rush. She did not reach out. She simply sat on the floor a few feet away and opened a book on her lap. Evelyn's face tightened with concern, but she did not stop her. Ethan watched Juno closely. Juno lifted her head, eyes fixed on the child. Grace looked down at the page, not at the dog, and began to read in a small, steady voice. The old dog waited beside the garden gate, where the flowers grew wild and the wind smelled like rain. Noah stood near the book table, holding his breath. The adults watched with the kind of silence that can either become judgment or understanding. Grace kept reading. After a minute, Juno shifted. Ethan felt the movement through the floor more than saw it. The old dog rose slowly, walked the few steps toward Grace, and stopped beside her. Grace did not touch her. She read the next sentence. Juno lowered herself to the floor and rested her head gently against Grace's knee. The room changed. It was not dramatic. No one gasped. But the fear in the air loosened, like a knot eased by patient fingers. The father by the refreshment table looked down. The woman beside him pressed her lips together and said nothing more. Martha's eyes shone. Harold cleared his throat as if the dust in the room had suddenly become personal. Grace turned one page and continued reading as though a German Shepherd resting against her leg were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan looked at Juno and felt pride rise in him, warm and quiet. Not because she had proved herself useful. She had never needed to prove that. But because, without knowing it, she had answered fear with gentleness. The afternoon should have ended there, with cookies, careful goodbyes, and Evelyn already planning the next reading day. Instead, as people began stacking chairs, Rachel appeared in the doorway with a face Ethan knew too well. It was the face of someone carrying trouble and trying not to spill it in front of children. "Ethan," she said softly, "can I speak with you outside?" He stood at once. Juno rose too, but he asked Noah to hold her leash inside the doorway. Just for a minute. Outside, the air felt colder. Rachel folded her arms against the wind. "Frank came to the shelter this morning." Ethan's expression hardened before he could stop it. "He says Juno still belongs to him," Rachel continued. "He claims she was removed without proper authorization, and that someone else had no right to surrender her. He wants her returned." Ethan looked through the window toward the room where Juno stood near Noah. "No. I know. No, Rachel. I know," she repeated, firmer this time. "But he brought papers." Ethan's anger came back, the old sharp kind from the day he first read Juno's file. But this time it had a shape standing behind glass, an old dog who had spent the afternoon resting her head on a child's knee. "What papers?" Ownership transfer forms, breeding records. Some look altered. Dates don't match what we found. Names appear in places they shouldn't. Rachel lowered her voice. I made copies. I also gathered the vet notes, the photos from intake, and the statements from 2 former workers who contacted the shelter after hearing Juno was safe. Ethan understood what she was offering and what she was asking him not to do. Because Juno lived with him now, because he had adopted her, because he was emotionally involved, he could not be the officer driving the investigation. If he stepped too close, Frank's lawyer could use it. Ethan hated that. But he also knew Rachel was right. I'll remove myself from the case, he said, each word costing him something. Rachel nodded. I'm sorry. Don't be. Do it clean. Give everything to Captain Moore. Captain Thomas Moore was 52, Ethan's supervising officer at the Astoria Police Department, a steady man with years of experience handling sensitive cases that needed careful records more than loud promises. Ethan trusted him, and that mattered now more than pride. Before Rachel could answer, a truck slowed along the curb. Ethan turned. Frank stepped out near the community house gate. He moved with the stiff confidence of a man who believed paper could make cruelty respectable. He looked toward Rachel first, then Ethan, then the open doorway behind them. His mouth tightened when he saw Juno inside. There she is, Frank said. That dog is mine. Juno heard his voice. The change in her was instant. Inside the doorway, her body dropped low, her ears flattened. She pressed hard against Ethan's leg as soon as he stepped back inside, trembling so deeply that Noah let go of the leash and moved away to give her space. Juno did not bark. She did not growl. She made no sound at all. That silence was worse. It was the silence of memory returning like a slammed door. Ethan knelt beside her. I'm here. Frank took one step toward the entrance. You people made a mistake. Ethan stood, placing himself between Frank and Juno. His voice stayed low, because there were children in the room and because Juno needed calm more than Frank deserved anger. You need to leave. Frank lifted the papers in his hand. Not without my property. Ethan felt the word property move through the room like something dirty tracked onto a clean floor. Behind him, Grace clutched her book. Evelyn placed a hand on the child's shoulder. Rachel's face went pale, but her eyes stayed steady. She is not going with you, Ethan said. You don't get to decide that. No, Ethan replied. The law will, and until then, you are not coming near her. For a moment, Frank seemed ready to argue, but people were watching. Not just Ethan, not just Rachel. Older neighbors, parents, children. Noah standing with his hands clenched, Grace with her book still open to the page about the old dog by the garden gate. It was hard, under that many eyes, to pretend cruelty was business. Frank lowered the paper slightly. This isn't over. No, Ethan said. It isn't. Frank left. Only after his truck turned the corner did Juno begin to breathe normally again. Ethan sat on the floor beside her while the room remained still around them. Grace moved first. She did not touch Juno without permission. She only sat a few feet away, opened her book again, and began reading from the place where she had stopped. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. Juno's eyes moved to the sound. Ethan looked at the people gathered in the room. Some had been afraid of Juno an hour earlier. Now they had seen what fear looked like in her. Not danger. Pain, not threat. Memory. And in that quiet, something shifted. The old dog no longer looked like a breed people had judged from a distance. She looked like a soul that had survived being treated as less than one. Ethan rested his hand near her paw. He could not investigate the case himself. He could not erase the past. But he could keep the door between Juno and the man who thought love was ownership. And for that day, that was enough. The fundraiser began with paper lanterns, donated pies, and the brave optimism of people who had checked the weather forecast and decided to believe only the gentlest parts of it. By 6 o'clock, the community house was full. Rain tapped against the windows, steady but not alarming, while neighbors carried folding chairs inside. Children arranged books along the tables, and Evelyn moved through the room with the calm authority of someone who could organize a meal, a raffle, and a small emergency before anyone else found the sign-up sheet. The goal was simple. Raise enough money to keep the community house open, repair what time and weather had weakened, and prove to the city that the place still mattered. Evelyn had called it a reading night, a supper, and a fundraiser all in one, because she said people were more generous when they had soup in their hands and a dog near their feet. Ethan had offered to help with parking and safety. Noah had organized the reading corner. Rachel had brought photos of senior rescue dogs from Harbor Light, along with folders explaining how adoption and fostering worked. Grace had drawn a sign that said, "Every old dog still has a story," and no one had the heart to correct the uneven letters because the message was perfect. Juno lay near Ethan beside the half-circle of chairs, calm but watchful. The events of the past week had left their mark. Since Frank's appearance, she had returned to scanning doors and listening closely to voices outside. Yet she had also stayed near Grace during the reading sessions, and she had begun to accept that not every person who looked at her wanted to take something away. That night, she wore a simple collar with her name tag resting against her chest. Ethan had checked the clasp twice, not because he doubted it, but because worry sometimes needed something harmless to do with its hands. Captain Moore arrived shortly after the first round of readings began. He did not come in uniform, which Ethan appreciated. He stood with Rachel near the refreshment table and spoke quietly enough that the children could keep reading. Ethan joined them for a moment while Juno remained within sight. "We executed the inspection this afternoon," Captain Moore said. "Rachel's documents helped. So did the worker statements." Rachel folded her hands tightly around a paper cup. "And the dogs?" "Several were removed from the property, mostly older females. 2 need urgent veterinary care, but they're alive." Rachel closed her eyes briefly, and Ethan saw relief pass across her face like light through a narrow window. Captain Moore continued. "Frank Evans is facing charges for animal neglect, falsified records, and operating outside the terms of his permit. There will be a process. It won't be finished quickly, but he will not be getting Juno tonight, tomorrow, or any time soon." Ethan looked toward Juno. She was watching Grace read to a little boy, her ears lifted every time the child turned a page. "Thank you," he said. Captain Moore nodded. "You did the right thing stepping back." "It didn't feel like it." "The right thing rarely does when your heart is involved." Before Ethan could answer, the lights flickered. A low sound moved through the building, not thunder exactly, but wind pressing against old walls. The rain sharpened against the windows. Conversations paused, then resumed with a nervous laugh or two. Evelyn looked toward the ceiling as if personally offended by the weather's timing. "It promised me drizzle," she said to Martha. Martha set down a tray of cornbread. "Weather does not keep promises, dear." Henry, standing by the door, announced that he had seen worse storms at sea. Harold asked whether the sea had survived the experience. For a few minutes, humor held the room together. Then the lights went out. The building fell into a thick, sudden dark broken only by phone screens and the pale wash of lightning beyond the windows. A child gasped. Someone dropped a spoon. The wind hit the side of the community house hard enough to rattle the frames. Ethan's training took over before fear could find a place to settle. "Everyone, stay calm," he said, voice firm but not loud. "Phones out. Lights on. Move away from the windows." Noah helped Grace gather the younger children near the center of the room. Rachel checked the shelter display table to make sure nothing had fallen. Captain Moore moved toward the front entrance with Ethan, both men listening as the storm rose outside. A sharp crack came from the porch roof. The awning over the front steps tore loose on one side and slammed against the railing. Rain blew through the doorway where wind had forced it open. People pulled back. The old building groaned, and somewhere in the rear hall a door banged again and again in the dark. "We need to move everyone out," Captain Moore said. "Not through the front if that awning comes down." Ethan nodded. Side exit to the church lot. St. Mark's Church stood less than a block away, a sturdier brick building with a basement hall often used for winter overflow meals. Its pastor had left the lights on in case the fundraiser needed extra space. At the time, it had seemed thoughtful. Now it felt like a blessing someone had prepared before anyone knew it would be needed. Ethan began directing people toward the side hallway. "Coats if you can reach them. Leave everything else. Stay together." The room moved with surprising order. Older guests paired with younger volunteers. Parents lifted children. Noah took Grace's hand and guided her toward the line. Juno stayed close to Ethan, her body tense, but she did not panic. She watched the hallway, the shifting lights, the moving crowd. Then, suddenly, her head turned toward the back of the building. She took 3 steps in that direction. "Juno," Ethan called softly. She stopped, looked back at him, then hurried toward the rear hall. Ethan frowned. "Juno." She returned at once, not all the way, just far enough to reach him. Then she caught the sleeve of his jacket gently in her teeth and pulled. It was not play. It was not fear asking to leave. It was direction. Ethan felt his breath change. "Noah," he called. "Where's Evelyn?" Noah turned from the side doorway, rain flashing behind him. "She was getting blankets." Ethan looked across the room. Evelyn was not among the people moving out. Her chair was empty. Her shawl was still draped over the back of it. Juno pulled again. The rear hall. Ethan pointed to Captain Moore. "Keep them moving to the church. I'm checking the back." "I'm coming," Noah said immediately. Ethan almost told him no, then saw the boy's face. Afraid, yes, but steady. And Noah knew the back rooms better than most. "Stay behind me." Juno led them down the rear hallway, her paws slipping slightly on the old floorboards. The emergency light at the end of the corridor blinked weakly, throwing red shadows across stacked chairs, donation boxes, and framed photographs of community picnics from years past. Water had begun seeping under the back door where wind drove rain against the building. The air smelled of wet wood and dust. "Evelyn!" Ethan called. No answer. Juno stopped in front of the storage room and scratched once at the lower panel. Then she looked at Ethan. Noah stepped close, voice shaking but clear. "She keeps blankets in there." Ethan tried the handle. It moved, but the door did not open. Something heavy had shifted behind it. "Evelyn!" he called again, louder. This time a faint sound came from inside. Not words. A small knock. Then another. Noah's face went pale. "She's in there." Ethan leaned close to the door. "Evelyn, it's Ethan. Are you hurt?" A muffled answer came thin beneath the storm. "My ankle. Door's stuck." Juno whined, low and urgent. Ethan looked at the frame. The old wood had swollen, and something inside, likely a fallen shelf or crate, blocked the door from opening inward. Water was moving faster along the floor now, running toward the lowest part of the hall. "Noah, get back." Noah stepped away, but not far. "What do I do?" "Hold the flashlight steady." Noah lifted his phone with both hands. The light shook at first, then steadied. Ethan drove his shoulder against the door. It held. He struck again. The frame cracked slightly. Juno barked once, sharp and startling, then darted toward the end of the hallway and back as if measuring the rising water and the time they did not have. Ethan tried again, harder. Pain shot through his shoulder, but the door shifted an inch. "Again," Noah said, almost to himself. "Again, sir." Ethan hit the door a fourth time. The latch splintered. The door opened halfway and jammed against a toppled metal shelf. Through the gap, he saw Evelyn on the floor. One hand braced against a stack of blankets, her face tight with pain, but alert. "Can you move toward me?" Ethan asked. "I can try." "No," he said quickly. "Wait." He squeezed through the gap as far as he could and shoved the shelf aside with his boot. Noah, small enough to reach through the opening, grabbed a fallen blanket bundle and dragged it clear. Juno stood close, trembling with effort, eyes fixed on Evelyn. At last, the door opened wide enough. Ethan stepped in and crouched beside Evelyn. Ankle? Twisted, I think. Pride severely injured. Even then, she managed that. Ethan almost laughed from relief. "We'll treat both," he said. "Noah, take the blankets. Juno, back." Juno stepped back just enough to give space. Ethan helped Evelyn stand, one arm around her shoulders. She winced, but did not cry out. Noah moved ahead with the light, guiding them around the scattered boxes. They had taken only a few steps when a surge of rainwater pushed under the back door and spread across the hall. Cold water covered Ethan's boots. The building gave another groan. "Move," he said. Juno ran ahead to the turn in the hallway, then came back, checking them, refusing to leave them behind. Once, near the doorway to the main room, Evelyn stumbled. Ethan tightened his grip. Noah reached out and caught the stack of blankets before it fell. Juno pressed close to Evelyn's other side, not holding her up exactly but steadying her with presence. They reached the side exit as Captain Moore came back in with a flashlight. "I was coming after you," he said. "Good timing," Ethan answered. Together, they got Evelyn outside. Rain struck hard and cold. The path to St. Mark's had become a shining strip of water, but people were lined beneath umbrellas and coats, guiding one another toward the church basement door. Harold and Henry stood by the entrance, directing traffic with the seriousness of airport ground crew. Martha had somehow taken command of the soup pots. When the group saw Evelyn, a sound moved through them, relief disguised as many voices speaking at once. Grace ran forward, then stopped when she remembered not to crowd. Evelyn reached out and touched her cheek. "I'm all right, sweetheart. Just made the storage room more exciting than necessary." Inside the church basement, warmth and light wrapped around them. Someone found towels. Someone else found coffee. A nurse from the congregation checked Evelyn's ankle and confirmed it was likely a sprain, painful but not broken. Evelyn accepted this news with dignity until Henry suggested a heroic rescue song, at which point she threatened to make him wash every dish in the building. The fundraiser did not end. That was the quiet miracle. People could have gone home. No one would have blamed them. The storm still raged outside. The community house was damaged, and the tables, pies, books, and donation jars had been carried over in a rush beneath raincoats. But instead of leaving, they unfolded chairs in the church basement. Rachel reset the senior dog display. Noah placed the damp books near a heater. Grace sat beside Juno on a blanket and read softly while the old dog rested her head near the child's knee. Ethan stood near the wall, watching as the room rebuilt itself. Captain Moore came to his side. "You know she may have saved Evelyn's life." Ethan looked at Juno. Once she had lain beside doors because she expected to be abandoned. Tonight she had run through a door again and again because someone else was missing on the other side. "She knew," Ethan said, "before any of us." The donations passed from hand to hand. People who had come with $10 gave $20. Those who had brought pies passed plates. A local hardware store owner, who had arrived late and soaked from the rain, promised supplies for repairs. A church member offered volunteers for cleanup. By the time the storm began to ease, Evelyn sat with her ankle wrapped, a blanket around her shoulders, and tears in her eyes she kept blaming on the coffee steam. Rachel checked the donation total twice, then looked across the room at Ethan and nodded. They had enough, more than enough. The community house would not close. It would be repaired. The reading program would continue. The Thursday dinners would remain. The old building that had nearly failed in the storm had somehow been saved by the people it had gathered under its roof. Near the end of the night, Captain Moore received a call and stepped into the hallway. When he returned, his expression was tired but satisfied. "The last 2 dogs from Frank's property are in custody with Animal Services," he told Rachel. "Charges are moving forward." Rachel covered her mouth with one hand. For a moment, she could not speak. Then she looked toward Juno, whose eyes were closed at last, safe in the circle of voices around her. Ethan sat down beside the old dog and rested his hand near her paw. He did not wake her. He only watched the slow rise and fall of her breathing. The storm had broken a roof, flooded a hallway, and frightened half the town. But it had also revealed something stronger than weather. A frightened dog could become a guide. A lonely boy could become brave. A community at risk of closing its doors could carry its tables through the rain and keep going. And Juno, who had once believed every doorway led to being left behind, had used one to bring someone home. The week after the storm, Astoria began repairing itself in the quiet, practical way small towns often do. People did not speak of heroism very much. They brought ladders, hammers, casseroles, towels, spare coats, and opinions about roof shingles. The community house smelled of wet wood and fresh paint for several days, and every time Evelyn tried to stand too long on her healing ankle, at least 3 people appeared to tell her to sit down. She accepted this with poor grace and excellent posture. Ethan helped where he could, though Captain Moore had ordered him to take 2 days off after the storm and after the long weeks surrounding Frank's case. Ethan argued that he was fine. Captain Moore replied that every officer who said, "I'm fine," after 3 difficult weeks was immediately less believable. So Ethan stayed home, repaired a loose fence board, took Juno on slow walks, and tried to remember what rest was supposed to feel like. The official confirmation came on a Friday morning. Rachel called first, but she did not make him wait for the news. "It's done," she said. And for a moment Ethan did not understand because his mind had been busy with coffee, grocery lists, and whether Juno had hidden a biscuit beneath the sofa cushion again. "What's done?" "Juno's adoption, legally confirmed. Frank's ownership claim was rejected. The transfer papers he brought were inconsistent with the records, and with the evidence Captain Moore's team found, there's no standing for him to take her back." Ethan stood in the kitchen with one hand on the counter. Juno was beside the back door, not pressed against it, just resting in a patch of morning light that had slipped through the glass. Rachel's voice softened. "She's yours, Ethan." He looked at Juno. "No," he said quietly. "She's home." Rachel was silent for a second. "That's better. There would still be legal steps against Frank." The charges would move slowly, because justice often walked with heavy shoes and a full folder. But Juno would not be part of his possession anymore. The other dogs removed from his property were safe with Animal Services and rescue partners. Some needed medical care. Some needed time. All of them needed someone to understand that survival was not the same as being healed. That afternoon, Ethan drove to a small hardware store near the river. The owner, a 60-year-old man named Peter Rivera, was a local carpenter who had donated supplies after the storm and had known Ethan for years through neighborhood repair calls. When Ethan explained what he wanted, Peter listened without interrupting, then disappeared into the back room. He returned with a small wooden plaque, smooth and simple. "I can engrave it by tomorrow," he said. Ethan looked at the blank wood. "Just her name." Peter nodded. "Juno?" "Juno. And where are you putting it?" "By the front door." Peter looked up, understanding more than Ethan had explained. "Good place for a name." The next evening, Ethan attached the plaque beside the porch light. It was not large. It did not need to be. The letters were clean and deep enough to hold shadow. Juno. Ethan stepped back and studied it while the evening wind moved along the street. Juno sat near the threshold watching him. "I know you can't read it," he said, "but other people can." Her ears lifted. "It means this is your house too." Juno looked from Ethan to the door, then beyond him to the street. She did not seem impressed by the ceremony, but when Ethan opened the door, she walked inside without waiting to be invited. That was answer enough. Spring arrived gently after that, not all at once. It came in small green promises along the sidewalks, in brighter mornings, in rain that smelled less like winter and more like soil waking up. Juno changed in the same way. Slowly, then suddenly enough to surprise him. She stopped hiding every treat. At first, she ate them only when Ethan stayed nearby. Then she began taking them to the living room rug. One afternoon, Ethan found her carrying the stuffed duck from room to room with the solemn focus of a dog transporting official documents. The duck squeaked beneath her teeth, and Juno froze, offended by its interruption. Ethan laughed so hard that he had to sit down. "You chose it," he told her. Juno dropped the duck, stared at it, then picked it up again as if giving it one more chance to behave. The sofa became another matter. For months, Juno had not stepped onto it. Then, one rainy evening, Ethan walked in from the kitchen and found her lying across nearly the entire length of it. Not perched, not testing. Fully settled, front legs stretched out, head resting on the arm cushion, eyes half closed with the calm authority of a creature who had discovered comfort and intended to keep it. Ethan stopped in the doorway. "Excuse me." Juno opened one eye. "I used to sit there." She closed the eye again. Ethan stood there a moment longer, then took the chair. "Fair enough." Each morning, when he left for work, Juno still watched from the front window. That part did not disappear. She tracked the sound of his keys, the weight of his boots on the porch, the closing of the truck door. But she no longer scratched at the floor near the exit. She no longer waited stiffly for hours by the gate. Sometimes Evelyn checked on her and found her asleep on the sofa with the duck beside her, as if guarding a ridiculous yellow witness. "She believes you now," Evelyn told Ethan one Thursday. Ethan looked through the window, where Juno's head rested against the back cushion. "Most days. That is how most of us believe anything," Evelyn said. "Most days." The community house reopened 3 weeks after the storm. The repaired roof held. The front railing had been strengthened. The hallway flooring had been replaced, and the storage room door now opened outward because Henry had loudly claimed this had been his idea all along, though everyone knew Rachel had suggested it first. The Thursday dinners returned with more people than before. Those who had once come quietly now brought neighbors. People who had eaten alone for years began arriving early to set chairs. Martha organized the dishes. Harold greeted guests like a retired mayor, though no one had elected him to anything. Henry fixed a wobbly table leg and told the story 6 times. Evelyn moved carefully on her ankle, but her spirit seemed to fill every corner of the room. She had not simply saved a dinner program. She had watched it become what she had always believed it could be, a place where people did not have to be lonely politely. Noah became a regular volunteer at Harbor Light. Rachel gave him a small badge that said Junior Reading Volunteer, and Noah wore it with quiet pride. He started with the shy dogs, the ones who pressed themselves into corners or watched hands as if every movement carried a question. He read to them from the same books he had once struggled through in Ethan's living room. Sometimes his words still caught. When they did, he waited, breathed, and continued. The dogs never laughed. They never rushed him. And over time, other children joined him. Rachel once told Ethan that the kennels had changed on reading days. Not because every dog became calm, but because the room filled with voices that asked nothing except to be heard. For animals who had known too much noise and not enough gentleness, that mattered. Juno became part of the program too, though on her terms. She was not passed from hand to hand. She was not crowded. Ethan brought her to the community house on reading afternoons and senior visits, and she chose where to lie. At first, people gave her space. Then, gradually, they hoped she would choose them. The same adults who had once worried about her breed now saved seats near her. Harold claimed Juno listened to his stories better than any human. Martha said that was because Juno was too polite to leave. Grace often sat with her book resting against one knee while Juno's head settled nearby. Sometimes Juno slept through half the reading, but everyone agreed that made her an excellent audience. One afternoon, a woman who had avoided Juno during the first event sat beside her for nearly 20 minutes, one hand resting near the dog but not touching. Her name was Diana Gonzalez, a 62-year-old retired nurse who had moved to Astoria after losing her husband and rarely stayed long after community dinners. Juno shifted closer and placed her chin near Diana's shoe. Diana looked down, then covered her mouth with one hand. "I used to have a dog," she whispered. No one rushed to fill the silence. Juno stayed. Diana stayed too. Ethan saw it from across the room and understood that Juno's healing had never belonged to Juno alone. Somehow, by learning to stay, she had taught others that they could stay too. The legal case against Frank continued, but its shadow no longer owned the story. The rescued dogs were being treated, fostered, and named by people who saw age not as damage, but as a history. Rachel kept careful records. Captain Moore kept careful pressure on the case. Ethan kept careful boundaries, because he had promised to let the law do its work. But at home, he gave Juno the kind of justice that did not fit inside a courtroom. He gave her ordinary days. Then came the afternoon that stayed with him. It was late April, one of those rare Astoria days when sunlight arrived like a guest who had finally found the correct address. The streets shone after a morning rain. The river carried pieces of gold light between the docks. Ethan returned from a short shift before dinner, tired but not heavy the way he used to be. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw the porch plaque beside the door. Juno. He smiled before he entered. Inside, the house was quiet, not empty. Quiet. There was a difference now. He set his keys on the small table and stepped into the living room. At first, he did not see her by the window. She was not beside the back door. She was not near the hallway, not on the edge of the rug, not angled toward any exit. Then he saw her. Juno was asleep in the middle of the living room floor, not curled tight, not ready to rise, not facing the door. Her legs were stretched out in complete, careless comfort, the stuffed duck near one paw and the old rubber ball resting beside her shoulder. Sunlight lay across her back. Her silvered muzzle twitched slightly as she dreamed. Ethan stopped. For a long moment, he did not move. He had seen Juno sleep before. He had seen her rest beside his chair on the sofa, near Grace, under the maple tree. But this was different. This was a dog without an escape plan. A dog not guarding the threshold. A dog not measuring how quickly she could leave if the world changed its mind. This was Juno, asleep in the center of the room, as if the whole house had finally become safe enough to hold her. Ethan felt the old ache in his chest, but it was not only grief now. It was grief with light around it. Claire would have loved this, he thought. She would have stood beside him, whispered something gentle, then probably told him not to wake the dog. So he did not. He lowered himself slowly into the chair and sat in the quiet. After a few minutes, Juno opened her eyes. She saw him. Her tail moved once against the floor. "Hey, girl," Ethan whispered. "I came back." Juno sighed, deep and peaceful, then closed her eyes again. She knew. At last, she knew. No one was coming to take her away. No one was waiting outside to claim her like property. No door in that house belonged only to Ethan. The kitchen, the porch, the sofa, the yard, the patch of sunlight in the middle of the floor, all of it had room for her, and for the first time in her life, Juno was not preparing to leave. She was home. In the end, Juno's story was never only about an old German shepherd finding a place to sleep. It was about what it truly means to belong. A home is not built only with walls, a roof, or an adoption paper signed at a desk. A real home is built through meals served at the same hour, doors that open again after goodbye, gentle voices that do not give up, and patience that stays even when old wounds suddenly return. Juno had spent much of her life believing she had to be quiet, useful, and ready to leave. But Ethan showed her something different. He showed her that love does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in a bowl of food, a soft lamp left on, a familiar walking path, and one simple promise kept day after day. I will come back. And in saving Juno, Ethan was changed too. The lonely house became warm again. The quiet neighborhood became a community again. A boy found confidence in his own voice. An old woman saw her dinner table grow, and a town learned to look at a wounded dog not with fear, but with understanding. This story reminds us that age never takes away the worth of a life. A scarred face can still carry gentleness. A tired heart can still learn trust. And sometimes, the one we think we are rescuing is quietly leading us back to love, faith, and the people we were meant to find. What do you think about Juno and Ethan's journey? Have you ever seen an animal help someone heal in a way words never could? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to read where you are watching from and what this story meant to you. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves animals, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories about loyalty, kindness, and second chances. Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you will come back again for the next story, where another wounded heart may find its way home.